A single father had just lost his job, struggling to stay afloat beneath a mountain of bills and the daily needs of his two young daughters. But no matter how heavily life pressed down on his shoulders, he never let it extinguish the kindness in his heart. So when he saw an elderly woman and a little boy stranded in a downpour, soaked, frightened, lost, and not knowing where to go, he didn't hesitate. He opened his door, brought them inside, warmed them up, gave them a hot meal, a place to sleep, and, more importantly, the genuine care of someone who chooses compassion over hardship. What he didn't know was that this small, tender act of kindness would change his family's life forever. Before I tell you what happened the next morning, let me know where you're watching this story from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss more emotional journeys full of unexpected turns like this one. And now, have you ever wondered how a single rainstorm could bring a new destiny right to your doorstep? Jonah Romer sat at the small kitchen table, his skillful hands carefully shaping a block of oak. The dim yellow light spilled over the lines he was carving, a tiny reindeer for the upcoming Christmas season. His hands moved by instinct. Every muscle seemed to remember each motion after months and months of repeating the same work. Suddenly, the living room light flickered a few times. Jonah let out a sigh and adjusted it so it would shine more steadily. His two daughters were asleep in the next room, curled up beneath mismatched blankets, beside a small space heater humming in its steady rhythm. He didn't dare turn the heater up any higher. Last month's electric bill had already pushed him to the edge of what he could handle. It had been 3 weeks since Jonah lost his job at the furniture workshop on the outskirts of Rockford. The company shut down quietly. No meeting, no warnings, just a letter slipped into an envelope and the guilty look in the manager's eyes. The workshop owner blamed the new import tariffs. Costs skyrocketed. We can't compete with foreign goods anymore, he said, shaking his head. We have to downsize if we want to survive. Jonah remembered clearly the moment he stood among more than 20 other workers, most of them single fathers and mothers just like him. Losing the job didn't just mean losing income. And meanwhile, prices kept climbing everywhere. Milk, bread, gas, even the wooden blocks he used for carving. The oak block he used to buy for $15 had now climbed to nearly $25. Almost everything these days has turned into a luxury. Even the final paycheck he was owed still hadn't arrived on time. Now, every dollar he used to raise his children came from his Etsy shop, Romer's Craft, where he sold handmade wooden items, fall animals, stars and angels for Christmas, tiny toys for baby shower parties. He stayed up until late at night, not because of passion, but because it was the only lifeline he had left. Every time his phone chimed with a new order, his heart jumped. A new order meant money for bread, peanut butter, maybe enough to buy more milk, even cough syrup if the girls needed it. The house itself wasn't much to look at. The paint on the walls was peeling. The sofa sagged in the middle. The window beside the front door had a draft so cold he had to stuff an old towel into the gap to block the wind. But it was still home. It was his. And every month, Jonah paid the rent with pride, even though sometimes it meant skipping meals. Jonah looked at the half-finished wooden block. In that rare moment of silence, the image of Sarah, his ex-wife, came back to him. She had left 3 years ago, leaving him with 2 little girls and a house full of memories. She hadn't died. She had simply left. I wasn't made to be a mother, she said on the last night. I'm sorry. Jonah didn't blame her. He was just tired. Tired of carrying everything alone. He whispered softly, as if reminding himself, the girls need me. I can't let them down. Jonah paused, glancing toward the girls' bedroom door. Light leaked through the crack, illuminating his exhausted face. He still remembered the day Jessa asked, "Daddy, why don't I have a mom like my friends?" He had knelt down, looked into his eldest daughter's bright blue eyes, and answered slowly, "Because I chose to stay. Because I love you." And Kylie, his 5-year-old, had never asked, but sometimes he saw her standing still, watching other kids get picked up by their mothers at the school gate. Those tiny eyes carrying a sadness that pierced straight through him. Jonah took a deep breath, pushing the ache aside. This wasn't the time to grow soft. He still had to finish the reindeer before morning came. That afternoon, the rain began early. At first, it was only a few drops sliding into long streaks across the dull window pane. But soon, thick sheets of rain were pounding against the roof like urgent drums. The sky shifted into a bruised purple, heavy and swollen, then darkened completely within minutes. Jonah looked out the window and let out a quiet sigh. Rain like this meant barely anyone would pass by, and even fewer would notice the little wooden trinkets he displayed near the porch, the only thing helping him earn a few extra dollars to care for his 2 girls. He stood up, pulled an old hoodie over his head, and stepped onto the porch to gather the items he had just arranged carefully on the makeshift wooden stand. Tiny wooden butterfly hangings, wreaths, and even the button-eyed stuffed cats his daughters adored. As he reached to close the door, something strange flickered at the edge of his vision. A streak of yellow and blue was rushing toward the porch through the curtain of rain. Then came a child's cry, thin, fragile, yet powerful enough to pierce through the roaring storm. Startled, Jonah stepped back and squinted. An elderly woman, drenched from head to toe, was staggering toward his gate. One hand clutched a faded umbrella, trembling violently. The other gripped the wrist of a little boy around 5 years old. His tiny feet splashed through freezing puddles with every step. The woman's eyes were wide open, but unfocused. Her silver hair clung to her forehead. Her lips kept murmuring disjointed words no one could make out. And the little boy, shivering, soaked, terrified, looked at Jonah as if he were the only safe place left on earth. Jonah didn't need even 1 second to think. "Hey! Come on! Hurry! Get in here!" he shouted, waving them toward him. "It's dangerous out there. You'll get sick." The boy immediately pulled his grandmother toward the porch. Jonah grabbed a towel from the hook beside the door and wrapped it around the child first. Evan clung to his leg, his crying softening into sniffles, while the older woman remained frozen, blinking at the floor as if she had no idea where she was. "Let me help you," Jonah said gently, guiding her inside. "It's okay. You're safe now, both of you." The moment they stepped into the warm house, the air filled instantly with the smell of wet clothes, the chill rising from them. And something else. Fear. Jonah crouched down, meeting the little boy's eyes. "I'm Jonah. What's your name?" The boy wiped his nose with his sleeve, his voice trembling and hoarse from crying. "Evan. And the person with you is—" Evan swallowed, his voice cracking with fear. "My grandma. Her name is Margaret, but she doesn't remember me anymore." A heavy weight sank into Jonah's chest. Margaret was staring blankly at the empty wall, her lips moving but forming no words. Jonah recognized that look instantly. He had once cared for a neighbor with early dementia. That same hazy, unfocused gaze, caught somewhere between panic and confusion, as if their mind stood constantly on the edge of 2 different worlds. Jonah nodded slowly. "All right, kiddo. I'm going to help you both get warm and dry. I've got a pot of chicken soup simmering on the stove. You like chicken soup?" Evan nodded. In the boy's mind, everything was still spinning. That morning, his grandmother had been laughing, pushing him on the swings at the park. She sang silly songs, bought him ice cream, but on the way home, she suddenly stopped in the middle of the street. "Who are you?" she asked. Evan thought she was joking, but that look, empty, as if someone had switched off the light inside her. He had screamed. He had grabbed her hand. But Margaret kept walking, lost among the crowd. Then the rain came, and Evan was scared. A fear that made him want to run as fast as he could, or disappear from the world altogether. But now, when Jonah spoke, his voice was deep, warm, and kind. And for the first time since the rain began, Evan felt safe. Only a little, but enough for him to breathe again. Jonah helped Evan take off his soaked jacket, then gently took Margaret's trembling hand and guided both of them to the small sofa in the living room. The sofa creaked under their weight, but it held. While stirring the pot of soup on the stove, Jonah glanced toward the two strangers sitting in his living room. A small voice inside him whispered, "What am I doing?" No money for medicine. No money for more food. This month's electric bill still sat on the table, untouched, with no idea when he could pay it. But then Jonah looked into Evan's eyes, full of fear, despair, and the faintest glimmer of hope that someone might help him. And he thought of Jessa and Kylie sleeping in the next room. If someday his daughters got lost, he would pray someone else would do the same. Jonah poured 3 bowls of soup, placed a few crackers beside them, and lit a small candle on the table to make the room look a little brighter. Sometimes, when the world gave you nothing but storms, the only thing a person could do was open the door. Jonah set the 3 bowls on the chipped coffee table. The tiny candle flickered, casting scattered waves of light and shadow across the wall. Evan was curled in the corner of the sofa, knees pulled to his chest, body still trembling despite being wrapped in a thick towel. Jonah handed the boy a bowl, crouched to eye level, and said warmly and firmly, "Here you go. Eat slowly, okay? It's hot." "Yes, sir." Evan nodded softly, his lips still quivering. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice so faint it almost dissolved into the air. Jonah picked up the second bowl and turned to Margaret. She sat motionless, hands resting on her lap, her eyes fixed on the flickering candle as though she were staring into something far, far away. Jonah knelt in front of her, offering the bowl with both hands. "Miss Margaret," he said gently, then raised his voice just a touch. "I made something warm for you." Margaret blinked a few times and slowly turned toward him. A flicker of recognition, or maybe just curiosity, crossed her eyes, but it vanished just as quickly. I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice dragging, exhausted, and distant. "I don't know where I am. This isn't the place." Her sentence trailed off as her eyes darted toward the wall, then the window, then to Evan, her face tightening in confusion. After that, she lowered her head, as if confessing a mistake. "That boy, he just keeps following me." Jonah froze for a moment. His fingers tightened slightly around the ceramic bowl, but he forced himself to stay calm. He set it down on the table, gently, as if placing down something fragile. "That's Evan," he said. "He's your grandson. You two have been together all day." Margaret shook her head, her voice trembling, frightened. No, that's impossible. I was at the store. I was buying jam or something. Then there was a train. I don't—" Her words fractured into disjointed murmurs. Jonah placed his hand over her cold fingers. "It's all right. You're safe now. Try breathing with me, okay?" His voice was low, slow, steady, the same way he soothed Jessa whenever she woke from nightmares. Margaret looked at him as if wanting to say something, but then she shook her head helplessly, closed her eyes, and leaned back into the cushion. Completely drained, Jonah stood and glanced toward the hallway. Jessa and Kylie were still asleep. He went into the back room, grabbed a dry blanket and one of his old sweaters, then returned to the living room, where Evan sat upright, eyes wobbling with worry. "Grandma's sick," the boy said suddenly, his voice shaking but clear. "This morning she was fine. She pushed me on the swing and laughed. But on the way home, she stopped. Like she was locked up. Then she didn't know who I was. She kept walking everywhere. I didn't know what to do." Jonah swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He draped the blanket over Margaret and sat beside Evan, pulling the boy close against his chest. "You did the right thing," Jonah said, gently smoothing the boy's wet curls. "You stayed with her. You were very brave." Evan nodded, but tears kept spilling down. "She's going to die, isn't she?" "No, sweetheart," Jonah whispered. "She's just scared. An older person's mind can act like this. But we're taking care of her, aren't we? Together." Jonah helped Evan eat a little more soup and handed him a towel to dry his hair. Then he made a small bed on the floor, pillows and blankets from the hallway closet, just like he always did when his daughters were sick and wanted to sleep close to him. When Evan finally drifted off, Jonah sat alone in the dark. He looked toward his daughter's bedroom. A part of him whispered, "What am I doing? I don't even know who they are." He remembered the night Sarah left. She said she couldn't be a mother. And now, he was taking on responsibility for two strangers. But when he looked at Evan, his tiny face softened in sleep, Jonah knew he had no other choice. Some things in life mattered more than safety. They were called characters. "If my girls see me do the right thing," he murmured, "they'll learn to do the right thing." Margaret had nearly fallen asleep sitting up, but around midnight, the real storm began. Jonah had just nodded off in the armchair when he heard rustling. He opened his eyes and saw Margaret standing at the front door, her shadow stretching long across the floor. "Miss Margaret?" She didn't answer. She reached for the door handle. Jonah shot up, racing across the room. "Miss Margaret, no. It's late. You need to rest." Margaret turned around, her eyes empty and wild. "He's waiting for me, at the red mailbox." "There's no mailbox here," Jonah said, laying a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're in my house. It's raining outside, remember?" Margaret blinked rapidly, then suddenly burst into tears. Sudden, violent, desperate. "I can't find him. My son. He was just here. Right here." Jonah lunged forward and caught her before she collapsed. He held her tightly and whispered, "Shh. I've got you. You're okay. I'm here." Her skin was burning. High fever. Jonah guided her back to the sofa, wrapped her in more blankets, then rushed to the kitchen for a cold towel. He placed it on her forehead, gently brushing aside her wet hair. She mumbled names, David, Thomas, Eleanor, but never Evan. Evan jolted awake, hugging his knees, his voice barely a breath. "She's never been like this. Never." Jonah turned and knelt beside him. "It's not your fault, Evan. Her mind is just tired, but she knows you love her. I promise." Evan leaned into Jonah, his breaths broken. "You won't let her go, right?" Jonah pressed a soft kiss to the boy's hair. "Never, sweetheart." Around 3 in the morning, Margaret tried to get up again, this time violently. "Get away!" she screamed. "Who are you? What do you want?" Jonah raised both hands, struggling to remain calm. "Miss Margaret, it's me, Jonah. I'm helping you." But when he reached toward her, She shoved him hard in the chest. Jonah stumbled, nearly falling. "Don't touch me!" she cried, her voice cracking with terror. Tears stung Jonah's eyes, not from pain, but from helplessness. He hadn't been able to keep Sarah, couldn't keep his job. And now he didn't know how to keep this woman safe in his own home. But he still tried. He stepped back, voice soft as a lullaby. "Miss Margaret, Evan is here. He needs you. Please sit down." At Evan's name, Margaret froze. She turned and saw the boy trembling in the corner. "Evan?" she whispered. "Yes, it's me," Evan cried, tears streaming down his cheeks. And in that moment, Margaret collapsed. Jonah lunged forward in time to catch her. That night, Jonah didn't sleep. He sat between two strangers, one young, one old, watching every breath they took while the storm outside kept howling. Every now and then, Margaret shifted, calling out names or reaching for shadows. And each time, Jonah took her hand. He didn't know what dawn would bring. But tonight, just tonight, this small, weary home had become a refuge. Not just from the storm outside, but from the storm raging inside Margaret's mind. Through the window, Jonah saw the first streaks of dawn cutting through the night. The rain still fell, but softer, calmer, as if the sky itself had grown tired after a night of fury. He brushed his hand gently over Margaret's silver hair, then looked at Evan, curled beside her. Two fragile lives that fate had delivered to his doorstep. And in that quiet moment, between the morning light and the soft breaths of the two sleeping souls, Jonah felt something shift deep inside himself. He was no longer just a man trying to survive. He was becoming the keeper of someone else's hope. The rain finally stopped. A little after 6 in the morning, Jonah noticed the first change. Silence. No more pounding water crashing onto the metal roof. No more wind lashing against the windows. Only the occasional drip from the gutters and the soft, cautious chirping of birds, as if they too were exhausted after the long night. Jonah sat hunched in the old armchair, his arms folded across his chest. His neck was stiff from staying awake to watch over them. A thin gray streak of early morning slipped quietly through the curtains, casting a pale but strangely peaceful glow over the living room. On the sofa, Margaret lay still, wrapped in layers of blankets that Jonah had pulled up and readjusted at least 5 times during the night. Her fever had broken sometime around 4 in the morning, after hours of mumbling, trembling, and clinging to scattered bits of memory. Now her breathing was light and steady, her hands no longer reaching for invisible things. Evan was curled up on the floor beside her, his small chest rising and falling with each breath, one arm clutching the little wooden dog Jonah had given him before he fell asleep. Jonah rubbed his eyes, stretched slowly so he wouldn't wake anyone, then walked into the kitchen and switched on the kettle. He stood there quietly, watching the milky white steam drift from the spout. Slow, gentle, much like the morning itself. His body was exhausted. But his heart felt heavy in a different way. Something about last night made him feel as though he had witnessed the most fragile part of being human. A child trying desperately to hold on to a grandmother slipping away from reality, and an elderly woman searching in panic for her way back to herself. And in the middle of all that, something inside Jonah had quietly changed as well. When the kettle whistled, he poured water over the last peppermint tea bag in the house, then walked softly back toward the living room. But as soon as he reached the doorway, he stopped. Margaret was sitting up. Her back was straight, her hair still messy but now gently tucked behind her ear, and, most importantly, her eyes. The eyes that had been lost and terrified all night were now clear, focused, awake. Jonah stepped into the room slowly. Margaret turned to him and smiled. A small, tired smile, but a sincere one. "Good morning," she said softly. Her voice was hoarse, a little weak, but no longer fractured. "I think I owe you quite a lot." Jonah blinked, tightening his grip on the mug. You remember?" Margaret nodded lightly. She looked down at Evan, then back at Jonah. "Yes, I remember the rain. I remember getting lost. I remember this little boy running after me, and me looking at him without knowing who he was." Her voice caught. "But now, I know." She reached down and brushed her hand through Evan's hair. The boy stirred, blinking groggily. Then his eyes flew wide open when he recognized her. "Grandma," he whispered. Margaret smiled wider, her eyes glistening. "Yes, sweetheart. It's me." Evan shot up and threw his arms around her, holding her so tightly she almost fell backward. She let out a raspy but relieved laugh and hugged him just as tightly, one arm around his back, the other smoothing his hair as if it were the most precious thing she owned. Jonah stepped forward and set the mug on the table. "You had a really high fever last night," he said. "You were confused the whole time. I was worried sick." Margaret looked up at him, still holding Evan close. "I have early-stage Alzheimer's," she said plainly. Her voice didn't shake. Only sadness lingered. "I was diagnosed last spring. I told myself it was early, that I would notice when it got worse." She swallowed hard. "Yesterday was supposed to be just a simple day at the park with Evan. But then, it was like the sky inside me went dark. I didn't know my name. I didn't know who he was. I just kept walking." Jonah knelt on one knee, his eyes softening. "You're safe now." Margaret shook her head, guilt flooding her expression. "I didn't tell my son. I didn't want to burden him. He's always busy, always flying somewhere. I thought if I pretended to be fine, I could protect him from this. But instead, I frightened him. I frightened Evan. And I ended up in a stranger's home, forcing you to carry everything." Jonah gave her a gentle, almost strangely tender smile. "You're not a burden. You're a person. And no one shows up at my doorstep by accident." Margaret stared at him for a long moment, then broke down in tears. "Why did you do it? You could have called the police, called an ambulance, but you took care of us." Jonah sat on the floor, leaning back against the sofa. He stayed quiet for a few seconds. "Years ago, my wife left the girls and me. She didn't die. She just couldn't handle the pressure. I used to be angry, used to feel abandoned. But one night, my daughter asked me, 'Daddy, do you hate Mom?' He paused, and I told her, 'No, I don't hate her. Adults get lost sometimes, just like kids, and when that happens, someone needs to open a door for them.'" Margaret fell silent. "Last night," Jonah continued, "I didn't know if I could help. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't shut the door. If my daughters see me do that, they'll learn to shut the door on others too. And that's not the world I want them to grow up in." Margaret wept openly. "Thank you. Thank you so much." She wiped her tears and took a deep breath. "May I borrow your phone? I need to call my son. He needs to know where we are." Jonah pulled his old Android phone from his hoodie pocket. The screen was cracked in one corner, but still worked. Margaret's hand trembled as she dialed the number. Her thumb hovered over the call button for a long moment, as if gathering all the courage she had left. The phone rang once, twice. Then a man's voice burst through, sharp, tense, overflowing with worry. "Mom? Mom, where are you?" Margaret closed her eyes as tears rose again. I'm safe now, Andrew. I'm all right. I'm so sorry. Right then, Jessa, 8 years old, walked sleepily out of the hallway, eyes still heavy with dreams. Daddy, do we have company? Jonah stood and pulled his daughter into a hug. Yes, sweetheart. I'll explain soon. For now, can you help me get a few more blankets? Jessa peeked over his shoulder, saw Evan and Margaret, and instead of fear, she offered a small, warm smile. They need help, Daddy? Jonah nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting into a gentle smile. Kylie, 5 years old, came scampering after her sister, stared at Evan for a moment, then asked with perfect innocence, Do you want to play dolls with me? Evan nodded, though he was still gripping his grandmother's sleeve. Moments like these, where children didn't see strangers, only friends, made Jonah certain that, in at least this one thing, he had raised his daughters right. Half an hour later, the sound of tires gliding over wet pavement made Jonah glance toward the front window. A sleek black SUV came to a sudden stop just outside the gate. He stepped closer, one hand gently lifting the curtain, the other braced against the worn wooden frame. The car rolled forward slowly, then jerked to a halt. Its glossy black paint reflected the faint morning sunlight, and the leftover raindrops glittered on its surface like tiny glass beads. The driver's door flew open before the engine had even fully shut off. A tall man climbed out, looking as if he had been racing against the night itself to get there. Late 30s, early 40s, wrinkled dress shirt, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, suit jacket draped loosely over one arm. Sharp features, rough stubble, and eyes soaked with the emptiness of someone who hadn't slept in many hours. The moment he saw the house, his brisk walk turned into a breathless rush. Jonah hurried out and opened the door before the man could knock. You must be Andrew, right? Jonah asked, his voice calm. The man's chest heaved violently. Yes, he panted. I'm Andrew Porter. Is my mother here? Is Evan here? They're both safe, Jonah replied, his voice low and warm. Come in. Andrew nearly stumbled as he crossed the threshold. His eyes swept across the small living room, then locked instantly on the sight before him. Margaret sitting on the sofa, still looking tired, but with clear, sharp eyes. Evan curled tightly against her, breathing steadily. Mom. Just one word, but it sounded like it fell from the deepest part of Andrew's chest. His knees went weak, and he dropped to the floor in front of Margaret, clutching her hands as if afraid that if he loosened his grip even a little, everything would vanish. What happened? Where did you go? I called the police. Every hospital within 15 kilometers. I thought you had... His voice broke, unable to finish the sentence. Son, Margaret whispered, her trembling hand cupping his cheek. I know. I'm so sorry. He stared at his mother for a long time. The confusion, relief, and anger tangled together, impossible to separate. I don't understand. Why didn't you call me? Why didn't you tell me you were like this? Margaret's face fell, her gaze heavy with exhaustion. Because I didn't want you to worry. I thought I still had time. I thought I could control it. Andrew closed his eyes, fighting down the flood of emotion rising inside him. Then he turned, directing his gaze toward Jonah, who had remained quietly by the door, silently taking everything in. You're the one who brought them into your home? He asked, his tone low but filled with gratitude. You're the one who found them? Jonah nodded. They showed up at my door in the middle of the storm last night. Your mother didn't know who she was. Evan was terrified and soaked through. I couldn't leave them out there. Andrew stood up, running a hand through his still slightly damp hair, then looked more closely at Jonah. His eyes skimmed over the small room, the old rug patched in several places, neatly stacked handmade wooden crafts in a basket, the small space heater humming softly in the hallway, and from somewhere down the hall came the faint sound of a child coughing. His voice softened. "You've got kids, too?" "Jessa and Kylie," Jonah answered. "They're probably awake by now." Andrew looked back at his mother and son, then turned to Jonah again. "You did all of this? For strangers?" Jonah met his eyes without flinching. "Last night, they weren't strangers anymore. There were two people in trouble. That's reason enough for me to open the door." A silence fell between them, heavy yet gentle. Andrew drew a deep breath, his voice turning hoarse. "Thank you. I don't even know your name." "Jonah Romer." Andrew extended his hand and shook Jonah's firmly. The grip weighted with emotion. "Jonah, I owe you more than I can say. I have no idea how to repay you." Jonah just gave a faint smile. "You don't need to repay me. Just take good care of your mother." But Andrew didn't let go right away. His gaze swept the room again. Jonah's tired face, the worn hoodie, the peeling paint on the walls, the small carved animals lined up neatly. The businessman in him woke up. "You made these?" he asked, nodding toward the colorful wooden pieces by the window. Jonah nodded. "I sell them online. I've been making them since I lost my job at the workshop." "Where did you work?" "At a furniture shop. Closed down last month. Couldn't handle the rising costs and the new import tariffs." Andrew paused for a beat. "Yeah, my company's been hit by that too." Then he looked Jonah straight in the eye. "But you're supporting your family just with these." Andrew walked over and picked up a wooden reindeer, turning it in his hands, studying every curve and line. The craftsmanship was far too good for a little garage setup like this. "Just enough to get by," Jonah admitted, "but I have to keep going. I've got two little girls to take care of. Giving up isn't an option." Andrew silently examined the piece, his expression shifting from appraisal to genuine admiration. Then he looked up, and even he seemed surprised by what he was about to say. "I run a company that distributes decor, handcrafted items and handmade goods. We've been looking for small suppliers with real skill. What you're making," he held up the reindeer, "is beautiful." Jonah only managed a slight frown, not yet fully understanding. "Thank you." "I'm serious," Andrew went on, his voice suddenly firm. "I want to help. Not just because you helped my mother and Evan, though God knows I owe you more than I can ever repay, but because what you're doing has real value. I have a network, resources. If you're willing, I want to partner with you, get your products into more hands, build something together." Jonah blinked. Those words seemed to hit a very deep place inside him, a place that had, for too long, known only survival, not dreams. "You mean a real contract?" "I'm talking about an entire platform, a marketing plan, a distribution system, and you won't have to do this alone anymore." Margaret watched Jonah from the sofa, a warm smile on her face. Evan slept against her, more peaceful than he had been in a long time. Jonah looked down at his dark, roughened hands, the fingers calloused from years of work, then drew a deep breath. For the first time in many months, he allowed himself to think about something bigger than just getting by. He lifted his head. "Okay, let's talk." Andrew smiled and shook his hand again. "I'll send you my contact details. Next week, I'll come back. Really come back. With a contract lawyer and a branding specialist. But there's one thing I can tell you right now. You won't have to worry about rent ever again. Not ever." Jonah's throat tightened. He had to swallow before he could speak. I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," Andrew replied, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Just keep doing what you've been doing, creating beautiful things, and opening your door to people." 3 weeks later, Jonah Romer stood in a space that had once been nothing more than a dusty storage corner. Gray, faded walls, nearly forgotten behind the East Side Market Co-op of Rockford. Now, it had transformed into a small, warm shop, filled with soft yellow lights, clean wooden shelves, neatly hung woven baskets, and brand-new display boards, all made by Jonah's own hands. His handcrafted pieces hung across the walls like tiny flags of survival. Wooden animals, Christmas ornaments, table runners with borders so intricate they looked almost like real lace. Right on the large wall above the counter, a wooden sign hung straight and proud. Carved in soft, elegant strokes were the words, "Romer's Grace." Jonah placed his hand on the edge of the new counter, inhaling the scent of fresh wood and the faint trace of lingering varnish. The space had taken only a few days to transform. Thanks to Andrew, he had called in builders, designers, branding specialists, yet Andrew had never once tried to take control. Everything, from the wall color to the shelf placement to the store's name, Andrew left entirely up to Jonah. "You're the heart of this place," Andrew had said once, kneeling on the floor as he opened a crate Jonah had brought from home. "I just want to make sure it's big enough for the world to hear you." Jonah had only laughed then, bowing his head and getting back to work. And now, standing in the finished shop, he heard tiny footsteps rushing from behind. Jessa ran in, beaming, holding a coil of yarn and a small green plastic dinosaur. "Daddy, Grandma Margaret made me a snake out of yarn. It even has eyes." Jonah laughed and bent down to lift the little creation. The snake was a bit fuzzy, its eyes slightly crooked, but it had a charm all its own. "She's getting better," Jonah said, ruffling Jessa's hair. "She might even give me competition soon." From the workroom at the back of the store, Margaret looked up, offering a thin but proud smile. Her hands still trembled sometimes, her memory had blank patches, but she came in every day, making simple crafts, watching over Evan, and feeling like she was still useful. She had told Andrew once, in a surprisingly firm voice, "Let me contribute. I don't want to just sit at home." Andrew agreed immediately, and soon they had built something far bigger. Under Jonah's guidance, they founded Hands of Grace, a cooperative for single parents, seniors, and workers who had lost their jobs but still had skills in their hands. They taught wood carving, sewing, and online selling, creating both jobs and hope. Andrew handled the business, marketing, inventory, shipping. Jonah, he was the creative soul. Opening day of the first store felt like a small festival. People came to look, browse, and buy. At a table nearby sat a pitcher of homemade lemonade. Kylie, in a pink dress Jonah had sewn from leftover fabric, was handing out cookies to everyone. When the first customer handed over money for a small wooden wreath, Jonah's hands trembled slightly. "It's beautiful," the woman said, turning the piece under the light. "You made all of this?" Jonah smiled, a bit sheepish. "Yes, ma'am. Everything is made right here." "It has a soul," she said, "not like the mass-produced stuff at the mall." Jonah could only smile bigger. By noon, they had sold out 3 baskets of goods. Around 2 in the afternoon, Andrew arrived. Shirt sleeves rolled up, speckled with paint. Carrying a folder, he quickly sat on a chair when he spotted Jonah. "How's it going?" he asked. Jonah leaned against the counter, cheeks slightly flushed from talking to customers all morning. Better than I dared hope. Andrew walked a slow circle around the shop, nodding with satisfaction. You've built something real here, Jonah. People can feel it. Jonah lowered his gaze, shy but glowing with pride. I just wanted to keep the lights on. Andrew tilted his head with a grin. And somehow, you ended up lighting far more than that. But the journey hadn't been easy. The first week, there were almost no customers. Jonah sat behind the counter, counting every dollar, thinking about closing. Just when his spirits hit rock bottom, an elderly woman walked in, picked up a wooden cloth, and burst into tears. My son used to make things like this, she whispered, voice trembling. But he's gone now. Thank you for keeping his craft alive. In that moment, Jonah understood he couldn't give up, not for money, but for meaning. Right then, the door opened again. A man stood in the doorway, hesitant. His hands were rough, his jacket patched, his clothes still smelling of machine oil. He carried a bundle of old fabric. Jonah stepped forward. Hello, can I help you? The man cleared his throat, glancing around. I heard this place helps people who know how to sew? Jonah nodded. That's right. You sew? I've upholstered seats for 20 years. Just got laid off. I've got skill. Just nowhere left to use it. Jonah gave him a wide, genuine smile. He pulled a registration form from behind the counter and handed it to him. Fill this out. We'll see where you can fit. The man looked at the paper, his eyes glistening. That's it? That's simple. That's simple, Jonah said, then added with a knowing smile, Here, no one gets turned away. Andrew stood nearby, arms crossed, quietly watching. Margaret looked over and nodded gently. Outside, the sun was beginning to set. A small crowd gathered around a new plaque mounted beside the door. In memory of that rainy night, when kindness opened the first door. Passers-by stopped, read the inscription, then looked into the window where warm light spilled out. Some stepped inside, curious. Others simply stood for a moment, smiled, and continued on. But each of them carried something with them. A story about kindness, about not closing the door when someone needs help, and about how a small act can change many lives. Jonah stood inside, looking out at the street. In his chest, a warmth spread, not from the heater, but from the truth that he had created a place, a community, an extended family for those who needed it. And that was exactly what he wanted his daughters to learn. When you open the door for others, you are also opening the door for yourself. Autumn settled over the neighborhood with crisp mornings and an amber sky. The breeze carried the scent of cinnamon, dried leaves, and rows of trees standing like gatekeepers, draped in brilliant shades of gold and orange. Change had arrived, not only with the weather, but with the life of Jonah Romer. Inside Romer's Grace, his small but cozy shop, morning sunlight streamed through the glass window, laying a warm glow across the wooden floor. Shelves were filled with handmade scarves, crocheted blankets, and tiny wooden turkeys for Thanksgiving. A small heater hummed softly in the corner, but the real warmth in the room came from the laughter of women and children, echoing throughout the space. Jonah stood behind the counter, arranging a new order. His fingers moved with practiced rhythm. Tape, thank you cards, tracking labels. It had all become a cadence, a rhythm of stability, of the sense of control over life he once thought he had lost. Just behind him, Margaret was helping a teenage girl learn how to hold a crochet hook. Don't grip it too tightly, Margaret said, her voice patient yet firm. Let the yarn guide you. Don't force it. Listen to it. Jonah glanced over and smiled. Bethany, one of 3 teens from the local shelter, sat quietly, absorbing every word. On their first day here, the kids barely spoke. Jonah knew that silence well. It wasn't indifference. It was the sound of wounds learning to trust again. In the back office, Andrew typed rapidly on his laptop, coordinating shipping schedules and updating supplier boards. Lately, he wore jeans and rolled-up sleeves more often than crisp suits. He looked lighter, less strained than in those early days. Perhaps he, too, was finding a different version of himself here, calmer, truer. He stepped out, stretched, and walked to Jonah's side. "Website traffic is up 28% this week," Andrew said, showing Jonah his phone. "We're getting international orders now. Germany, Australia, even one from Japan." Jonah laughed, eyes widening. "Someone on the other side of the world is buying something Kylie made?" "It's not just Kylie's work," Andrew replied, voice soft but full of pride. "They're buying you, Jonah. Your vision, your heart." Jonah leaned against the counter, slowly shaking his head. "I never asked for any of this." "You didn't have to ask," Andrew said, standing close beside him. "You deserve it." They both fell silent for a moment, taking in the scene before them. Women of all ages gathered around the tables, talking, sewing, some teaching, some learning, some laughing, some simply existing in peaceful quiet. Jessa and Kylie ran past like little gusts of wind, pieces of ribbon tied around their waists like superhero belts. Jonah observed the life unfolding around him. Close, rough-edged, honest, beautiful in its imperfection. Then he turned to Andrew, lowering his voice. "Do you know what scares me the most?" Andrew raised a brow. "What?" "That all of this could disappear. That it's just a beautiful dream. And one day, I'll wake up again in that tiny old house, broke, fighting to keep the lights on with nothing but a basket full of hope." Andrew looked at Jonah for a long time, eyes serious yet warm. "That won't happen," he said slowly. "You built something people can't take away. Not because of me, but because of who you are." Jonah's eyes glimmered, though he didn't cry. He didn't need to anymore. That stormy night had wrung out the last of his tears and left something else behind. Resilience. Right then, the door opened. A young reporter stepped inside, camera slung over her shoulder. "Is it true all of this started just because someone knocked on your door during a storm?" she asked. Jonah looked straight into the lens, his voice low but steady. "No," he said. "It started because I opened the door." That night, when locking up the shop, Jonah stood under the awning, watching the drizzle fall over the street. He remembered the night Margaret appeared. Remembered himself standing in the rain just like this. The night Sarah left. The night the factory closed. The night he thought he was about to lose everything. But he hadn't lost. He had found. And what he found was this: when you open the door for someone else, sometimes you're opening a door for yourself. The next morning, a man stopped in front of the shop and read the wooden plaque. He turned to his wife and read aloud, "In memory of that rainy night, when kindness opened the door." I wonder what story is behind that. Jonah, standing nearby, smiled and stepped forward. "It's the story of not closing your door when someone needs you," he said gently. "Because sometimes we're the ones who need help. We just don't realize it yet." The man nodded thoughtfully, then pushed the door open. That evening, as the sun set over Rockford, light spilled out from Romer's Grace. Not just electric light, but the glow of hope, of community, of compassion, learning how to survive on its own. Inside the shop, candles were lit. A few women continued working, their faint laughter drifting through the room. Margaret was teaching a newcomer how to tie a yarn knot. Evan and Jonah's daughters sat on the floor, painting, bright colors blooming across the sheets of paper. Andrew stood beside Jonah, both of them looking out through the window. "Do you know the most miraculous thing about all this?" Andrew asked. "What is it?" Jonah turned. "That it didn't start with money, or a business plan, or any marketing strategy," Andrew said with a smile. "It started because a man opened his door in the middle of a storm. That's it. One small gesture, but it changed everything." Jonah nodded, saying nothing more. He didn't need to, because sometimes the biggest changes begin with the simplest acts, and sometimes all the world needs is someone willing to open the door. Please join us by hitting like and subscribe. Turn on notifications so each day begins with a story warm enough to soften your heart.